As someone who spent a good part of his life presiding over companies which built large, complex econometric models, Gillian, I think we have much to learn from anthropology, and you may have the right answer to the new wave of economic modeling, agent-based modeling, looking at individual behavior and individual behavior within individual cultures and how those cultures interact. I can see a whole new career now of building new kinds of models. I'd like to address some of CED's experience with global imbalances and talk about how the situation has somewhat changed since we first took up the topic. In 2006 and 2007, Bill McDonough, the former president of the New York Fed, he was then the vice chair of Merrill Lynch, he and I chaired a CED study on global imbalances. And we released our report in September of 2007. That study was started because of CED's concern about the trade deficit in the United States and the trade surplus of many of its trading partners had grown so imbalanced. As you will recall, the current account deficit had reached about 6% of GDP in 2005 and 2006, which was an unprecedented level. And the counterpart of those deficits was large current account surpluses in the oil exporting countries, in Japan, in China, and certain other Asian and European countries, which resulted in extremely large holdings of dollar assets by those countries. As a consequence of that, the U.S. net international debt rose to about over 16% of GDP in 2006. We felt the causes of those imbalances were certainly declining savings in the United States, extremely high savings rates in a number of the surplus countries, a marked slowdown in U.S. export growth coupled with very rapid domestic U.S. growth, which drove increased imports into this country, rising energy prices, exchange rate intervention, both by China and certain other countries, and somewhat limited access in a number of cases to international markets. So there were a lot of causes. We did think that it was likely, this may be a Goldilocks situation, that market-driven changes in exchange rates and consequent adjustments in the structure of global demand would produce a more or less orderly adjustment of these imbalances over time. Significantly, we took this view that it could work out that way provided there were no major shocks, which I'll return to in a moment. However, Bill and I and the CED subcommittee were by no means sanguine that these imbalances should be left to cure themselves automatically. Because of the risks that these imbalances represented if a shock did occur, we aggressively urged that countries experience imbalance take policy actions to do their part to move toward global adjustment, both by rebalancing global demand and by changes in relative prices through exchange rate mechanisms. We strongly believed that these policies needed to be done through multilateral cooperation, and that real leadership by the United States was needed to get the process started. We called for the U.S. to avoid any protectionist response and to increase its national savings by eliminating its fiscal deficit in 5 years. How's that for being ambitious? Through expenditure cuts, increased revenues, and a more disciplined budget process. We pointed to a series of past CED studies and recommendations, some of which Pat Gross mentioned at the outset, that pointed the way on how to deal with these areas. We recommended that Europe and Japan institute structural reforms to spur their domestic economic growth, and we called for China to expand public consumption in health care, education, pensions, and other programs that would strengthen the social safety net provided to its citizens. We also called for financial reform within China, particularly to provide consumers with better financial services. Significantly, look for near-term appreciation of the RMB by some 10%, followed by increases in the range of 5 to 7% per year for several years. We look for the petroleum exporters to increase public and private investment programs, and we call for the Gulf Cooperation Council states to abandon their dollar pegs in favor of a currency basket, as had been done by Kuwait. Finally, we called on the IMF to increase its surveillance and its disclosure of the imbalance problems, coupled with regular multilateral consultation on the progress made toward reducing these imbalances. Now, let me ask what's happened in the intervening 3 years since we released that report, and what is the future for global imbalances? Well, we certainly did have a shock. Not the dollar crash that some had feared from a steadily increasing U.S. current account deficit, climbing debt-to-GDP ratio, or growing negative net international investment position. Instead, we had near global financial collapse and the Great Recession, with unanticipated flight to the dollar in late 2008 and 2009. This attraction to the dollar even continues at times at the present, as Europe faces concerns about stability, bailouts, and sovereign defaults, or as North Korea engages in military adventurism. The shock we did have has divided the world into two new camps. And I think Janet Yellen gave us a very good picture of this. While there are certainly some deficit and surplus countries in terms of trade and current account balances, we now view the world as more divided between developed and developing economies. Since the developed countries, largely the U.S. and Europe, had the largest asset bubbles and overextended financial systems, they bore the brunt of the economic collapse and have the hardest path to recover and resume growth to near their potential. In these countries, output dropped sharply, unemployment increased to high levels, asset prices plunged, banks failed or took large write-offs, and government debt soared due to falling receipts, increased benefit payments, stimulus programs, and bailout costs. The process of full recovery is a long one, as governments go through fiscal consolidation and financial institutions and consumers repair their damaged balance sheets. With the dust settling from the Great Recession, it appears to my company, IHS Global Insight, that the U.S. is stuck at around a 2.5% growth rate for a while, plus or minus, before it picks up some steam and approaches 3% in 2012. Due to high debt levels and weakness in housing and construction, it will be difficult for the U.S. to do much better. For the next couple of years, and for some of the same reasons, the Eurozone and the UK should grow around 1.5%, though the UK might do a bit better in 2012 and get just over 2%. The outlook for Japan is bleak, with low domestic consumption, weaker exports, and a strong yen keeping growth under 1% this year, and just 1% in 2011, and just over 1.4% in 2012. The developing countries, while not participating in the financial excesses and asset bubbles in any significant way, have fared much better through the Great Recession. Some have had only a brief and mild recession, and others have avoided recession altogether. The exception is Eastern Europe, with very high debt and heavy dependence on Western European banks, investment flows, and export markets. While China will slow from 2010's projected 10.1% GDP growth to probably 8.3% in 2012, this will represent a successful soft landing that itself will help tame their inflation. We forecast that India is going to keep growing through 2012 at a bit better than 8%. Brazil in the 5 to 5.5% range, and Russia around 4%. Growth in the emerging markets overall is running, and will keep running for a few years, at 2.5 to 3 times faster than the growth in developed countries. This is a different kind of an imbalance than we've seen in the past. Now, what do these changes brought about by financial collapse and Great Recession mean for global imbalances that we were so concerned about in 2005 and 6? I can name 3 significant ones. First, the slower U.S. growth has relieved some of the pressure on the U.S. current account deficit. This deficit fell to a recent 2.9% of GDP low in 2008 and only expanded to 3.7% of GDP in 2009. With improved U.S. productivity, higher growth in developing markets, and trade-weighted exchange rate declining since the highs of 2009, the U.S. current account deficit is projected to stay at an absolute level at about $1.5 trillion annually for the next few years, and then begin shrinking. The level of exports could actually catch up to the level of imports by 2020. Second, while the current account deficit may be less troublesome for the U.S., The need to borrow from both domestic and foreign sources to finance a persistent federal deficit has increased. Even with assuming some measures are taken to address this deficit, we at IHS Global Insight project that the federal deficit in 2012 will be just under $1 trillion, or about 6% of GDP. And even by 2014, will still be around $700 billion, or 4% of GDP. These large annual federal deficits and growing debt-to-GDP ratio may have a silver lining in that much more serious attention is being paid to this issue. Taking aggressive measures to reduce the long-term structural deficit is being discussed by the co-chairs of the President's Commission, whose report may be imminent, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and the CED. And it was certainly a key issue in recent congressional elections. I hope this momentum can be sustained and increased. While nothing should be done to choke off the fragile recovery, longer-term actions to reduce this federal deficit will increase national savings and further contribute to relieving pressure on global imbalances. Actions on the long-term deficit taken now will reassure financial markets while not interfering with the recovery. Indeed, such actions will help by restraining long-term interest rates. Third, with very modest growth rates expected from the developed countries taken as a group, it has become clear to those developing countries that rely on export-led growth that structural adjustments are really necessary to stimulate domestic demand and achieve satisfactory overall growth rates. The emphasis being placed on this new approach by China and other export-oriented countries is encouraging. Although triggered by the Great Recession, this is one of the major actions that the CED 2007 report called for. While we can be encouraged that these actions are underway to alleviate global imbalances, even if some of them have been undertaken for other reasons, there is still much to be done to address the imbalance issue more completely. The most obvious area is in currency adjustment. If anything, there may have been more currency interventions recently rather than less. While some of these are aimed at maintaining competitiveness, other interventions have been based on deflationary fears, reducing capital inflows, or maintaining competitiveness with China due to its dollar peg, or largely dollar peg. Interventions should be discouraged, since we need to avoid the outbreak of currency wars. Such wars have the potential to spill over into protectionist retaliation and full-blown trade wars. Another area where we have work to do is to get a coordinated system of financial oversight and regulation around the globe, and I think that that's another big contributor to reducing world systemic risk and imbalances as well. While somewhat halting and imperfect, a remarkable amount of policy coordination was achieved, largely through the efforts of the G20 and leading central banks in late 2008 and 2009 to address the economic crisis. While there has been less agreement on proposals lately, I remain hopeful that the world's leading economic policymakers can and will make real progress in addressing global imbalances in a more coordinated way. The Great Recession has made the imbalance problem less acute, and it has stimulated actions that do address it, even if these actions have been taken independently of the imbalance problem. International organizations and countries around the world now have a real opportunity to continue to focus on the causes of imbalances and put lasting solutions in place that will lead to more balanced and stable growth for all participants in the future. Thank you very much.